The second question on that note is, so this whole Western world we consider Edom, and then the other world is Ishmael. So within that world, who is the dominant player? Who is the Magog? Who is the main oppressor of the Jews? And this is the second question that I got, which is, wouldn't it be more fitting to identify that oppressor, that Magog, that superpower, that Roman Empire as the United States? And you'll find that very often, that people will identify the U.S. as, like especially when Barack Obama was president, people like to identify him as Gog, for instance. And we mentioned before that George Bush, the father, was H.W. Bush. His nickname was Magog or something like that, or Gog, or Magog was his nickname in his Skulls and Bones Society. So some people point to these things. And it's true, I even mentioned in one of my books that it's true that Washington, D.C. was built on a plot of land that was actually originally called New Rome. So that original plot of land, the person who had settled it first had called it New Rome before it was rebuilt and as a city and named after George Washington, obviously. So some people will identify the United States as this big bad oppressor, and there is an argument to be said for that. However, and that's what I really want to focus on today, which is this Russian Jewish history, and how has Jewish history played out in Russia, and what role has Russia and the USSR played in Jewish history, a really monumental role. That's what I want to explore today, and show you how, whereas in the United States, Jews have always lived pretty comfortably, and it's been a safe haven for Jewish people, and the United States is still Israel's biggest ally on the world stage. But Russia is quite opposite to that. Jews have played a really important role in American history, and America has been generally very good to the Jews. People don't know this, but probably the single largest individual financier of the American Revolution was a Jew named Haim Solomon. So Haim Solomon probably, from any individual, gave more money for the cause, and probably the United States wouldn't even exist without him.
We were very fundamental in their...
Perhaps. Yeah, well, we'll get to that. So I'm just trying to say that the United States really wouldn't exist without Jewish support. Jews played an important role in its founding, and the United States from its beginnings was actually a safe haven for Jews. And America's always been good to the Jews. But Russia, I want to show you some things that's quite on the contrary, because many Jews, even to this day, right, are Russian and Russian-speaking. At one point, something like half the world's Jews lived in the Russian Empire. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. In 1772, especially, there was the first partition of Poland. Basically, the Prussians, not the Russians, the Prussians and the Russians. Remember, the Prussia is like the pre-Germany. Prussia is basically what became Germany, let's say, the leading Germanic kingdom. Prussia and Russia and the Habsburgs, the Austro-Hungarians, basically decided to split Poland between them. So that first partition of Poland was in 1772, and then another partition later. By the end of the 18th century, Poland was basically split between these three. So Russia now had an even larger, massive influx of Jews. And basically during this time, with Queen Catherine of Russia, the Great Catherine the Great, she basically confined the Jews to what was called the Pale of Settlement. So Jews couldn't live in Russia proper. A Jew couldn't legally live in Moscow unless maybe they got a special exemption. But Jews were confined to the Pale of Settlement, which is like what's today Belarus, Ukraine, a little bit of Poland, that region of Eastern Europe. So that's where Jews were forced to live. And at that time, in the 18th century, 40% of the world's Jews, 5 million Jews lived there. So it was like the single largest place where Jews lived. And that policy continued until World War I. And Jews were not allowed to live in the big cities. They had to live in small towns. That's where you had the shtetls, and they were very impoverished. They couldn't hold most professions. They couldn't even be farmers. They were confined to very limited professions. They didn't have many educational opportunities. Unless they converted to Christianity, most of society was kind of barred to them. And so life was not very good over there. And they also there was an imposition. The Russians thought it would be a great idea. We can assimilate the Jews by taking their young men into the military, and these are the infamous Cantonist laws. It applied really not just to Jews, it applied to everybody. It was basically ways to conscript Russians into the army, but for the Jews in particular, the Russian Empire required that for every 1,000 Jews, 4 had to be sent from every community, and they had like quotas of how many Jews had to be sent to join the Russian army, and they would have to go to military school for 6 years and serve in the military for 25 years. And the hopes was that through that we will assimilate them and make them Russians, and that there was this kind of push to convert them, and if they didn't convert to Christianity, they could not get a promotion in the army, so they would stay, just at the bottom ranks. And throughout that time, only 8 or 9 actually got promoted, despite without converting. Only 8 or 9 were so great that the imperial army gave them a promotion, even though they stayed Jews. So you only had 8 or 9 in all the whole history over this century. You only had 8 or 9 Jews who were officers in the imperial army, because the rest had to convert to go anywhere to make it in the army.
Therefore, what others converted?
They say it's estimated that at least 30% actually did convert. And many more didn't convert, but basically intermarried, of course, because they were posted God knows where, and they would have married others. And so they were still, a great majority of them were gone within a few generations, were no longer connected to Judaism in any way. So it was quite tragic. And it's estimated that it's depending on which numbers, as low as 30,000 and as high as 70,000 Jewish boys were forcibly abducted and converted in this way. So it was not a happy time to live in the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, to be a Jew, which is, again, where the majority of the world's the single largest place for Jews to live at that time, and it was terrible. And of course, you had the pogroms. You always had these persecutions, soldiers raiding your village, killing, raping, pillaging. And there were many, many pogroms. Some were local, some were large, some were state-sanctioned, some were just bands of thugs and soldiers who were just looking to have fun. And again, over the whole era, even before the Pale of Settlement, we know that the Khmelnytsky massacre was probably the worst. That was in the mid-17th century, and Khmelnytsky today is a great hero, Ukraine's national, one of their founding fathers, who's on their money, who's in their main square in Kiev. And Khmelnytsky killed something like 150,000 Jews probably. So that was one of the worst pogroms in this region.
But they say during the Holocaust, the Ukrainians killed 2 million Jews.
I don't know if it's 2 million, but it's definitely... The Ukrainians had their own Nazi SS division. And yeah, the Babi Yar massacre, that was a bad one. I think that was maybe 30, 40, 50,000 Jews, yeah. And probably one of the last great pogroms or terrible pogroms was in Kishinev in Moldova in 1903. And the death toll was relatively small, maybe 150 were killed, but thousands of homes were destroyed, women were raped. It was really a terrible sight. And that actually inspired the second Aliyah to Israel. The second Aliyah started in 1904. The second Aliyah was in 1904, and it was almost entirely Russian Jews that came to Israel. So if you know the history of Israel a little bit, the first Aliyah didn't really accomplish much. Most of the people that came to Israel in the first Aliyah in the late 1800s ended up leaving. But the second Aliyah, these were people who had experienced such horrible lives in the Russian Empire. It was something like 35,000 Jews, almost all from Russia, came to Israel, and they had nowhere to go back, so they made it work. And that was the critical push that allowed Israel to become a thing. The second Aliyah started in 1904. The first kibbutz, Degania Aleph, was started in 1909. And Tel Aviv was founded in 1909. So all these things actually took place during the second Aliyah. So that was critical. And this is a good segue into two major movements emerged because life in the Pale was so horrible. Jews had to deal with it somehow, and two major movements emerged to deal with this terrible reality. One was to deal with the problem from a religious way, from a spiritual way, and the other was to deal with it politically and nationally. So the first one was Hasidism. Right? The Hasidic movement took off here in this place, in the Pale of Settlement, within the Russian Empire, to try to address this problem in a religious way. Say yes, life sucks. Yes, we're poor. Yes, we're oppressed. But let's be happy anyways. Right? Hasidism was very ecstatic. It was just very much about music and dance and alcohol and smoking and having fun, and it was more lenient with the law. Right? Like even to this day, like Hasidic groups will be lenient with prayers, like prayer times, right? Like Chabad, your local Chabad probably starts Shabbat services at 10 a.m., which is like way past the halachic time, especially here, like depending on like in the summer, let's say. It's way past the halachic time to do all these things, but like that was their thing. It was like, take it easy, right? Pray when you feel like it, make sure you've slept well, you have good energy, right? Like it was more lenient. That's one of the reasons why it was opposed, right? Hasidism was very strongly opposed originally. The Hasidic leaders were even excommunicated. One of the reasons was because they were very lenient. A lot of the early stories of the early Hasidism was like very light with, more lenient with Jewish law, saying like, take it easy. Let's take it easy. Life's hard as it is. Let's have fun. Let's enjoy. Let's find more spiritual ecstasy.
The Baptist movement, it's all over the world. It's
Right,
a great
right.
movement.
That's right. So, interestingly enough, some of the early Chabad Rebbes actually credited the Vilna Gaon, who excommunicated them, credited him with saving Hasidism in the sense that because he opposed them, it forced the Hasidim to become more halachic and to be more serious. And so there's statements from the early Chabad Rebbe, like the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, that because the Vilna Gaon opposed them, that inspired the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, to write the Shulchan Aruch Harav. He wrote an halachic text. Why did he write an halachic text? He wanted Hasidim to remain within the halachic box and to remember that you still have to be Torah observant Jews. They didn't want to slide towards a reform, and which was also becoming popular at the same time in Western Europe more. And so there's even sources like that have the earlier Lubavitcher Rebbe's even thanking the mitnagdim, the people that opposed them, because they were able to, in so doing, keep them more halachic and keep them more in line. If you want to learn more, I would ask you to visit Kotzk blog. He does a lot of great work on this, and he has a lot of great articles about the history of Hasidism. There's also a good book called The Quest for Authenticity, and you can check that out as well. So that early Hasidism doesn't really exist anymore, right? Like the Hasidim that we have today, except perhaps maybe Chabad, but the Hasidic groups today, they've retained the clothing, but the original Hasidism of the Baal Shem Tov, that really ecstatic Hasidism, has mostly been replaced. The Hasidic groups today basically became more like the Haredi, Litvish, and they've admitted that. They've admitted that. The Sfas Emes said that the Hasidism of the early days is that he even went so far as to say that like we don't need that ecstasy anymore. We should just focus on Torah and mitzvot, right? Like so. It became more like mainstream Haredi. The Satmar Rebbe said that the Hasidism of the Baal Shem Tov is dead. It no longer exists. It's totally different. The early Hasidim were totally different than what we would expect today. Chabad still retains a lot of the qualities of the early Hasidim. And within Chabad, you will hear it often said that they're the only legitimate Hasidim left. They will make that claim. And they're probably right. Breslov also. Chabad really carries the message in terms of their work in loving every Jew and going all over the world and in their kiruv and all that. That's really... That was really the idea of the Baal Shem Tov, right? Who had that vision where he ascended to heaven and he was told that Mashiach won't come until you spread your ways all over the world. And so Chabad really takes that kind of personally and makes it their personal mission to do, and that's why Chabad's been so great and so successful. So the first movement that took off in the Russian Empire amidst the suffering of the Pale of Settlement was Hasidism. Again, to deal with the problem from a more religious, spiritual way, to make people happy. But as we've seen, Hasidism the original Hasidism really kind of petered out by the end of the 19th century. The early Hasidism was no longer there. Hasidism kind of went mainstream and went more like Haredi mainstream by the end of the 19th century. So it didn't last. And so to replace it almost, you had another movement that took off right as Hasidism was slowing down. Another movement really took off. And that's to deal with the problem. Well, that didn't work. Let's deal with the problem politically and nationally, which is Zionism. Right? So Zionism really had its beginnings, of course, before all of this. And they're always what you would call proto-Zionist. Hasidism itself, early Hasidism, was very Zionistic because all the early Hasidim wanted to go to Israel and like usher in the redemption. They said, we're going to go there and we're going to like make God send Mashiach. And there's even like stories of like the Baal Shem Tov like collaborating with other rabbis saying, let's just go. He tried. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, tried to make Aliyah. It didn't work. He ended up coming back to Europe. But other Hasidic groups actually did go to Israel and succeeded. Right? The most famous is Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk. So he, in 1777, actually got 300 Jews to Israel. And they settled there. And they remained there. So, and there were other Hasidic groups, and later even also non-Hasidic groups, that actually came to Israel. So they already started this like Zionistic idea. And so there is an overlap there between Zionism and Hasidism. And it's kind of ironic, again, comparing modern day Hasidism to the early Hasidism, because the early Hasidism was all about, let's bring in the redemption, let's make God send the redemption, let's like actively go to Israel and settle the land. And today, most Hasidic groups are the exact opposite, right? They're saying, we can't force the redemption, we have to wait for God. Most of them don't support the state of Israel, although that's not only because of this, it's only for all kinds of reasons. Because of the secular state and all the big problems that the secular state has done for religious people.
So on that note, are you talking about modern political Zionism or like religious Zionism?
So I think a little bit of both, and I'll explain. I think a little bit of both. So Zionism really, I think we mentioned this before, we associate Zionism with like Theodor Herzl, and mostly like Ashkenazis, but actually it started with a lot of Sephardi rabbis that really pushed this. And the main one was Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai. Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, he, in 1840, he established the first real Zionist organization, which was called the Society for the Settlement of Israel. That was in 1840, which is 5600 on the Jewish calendar. And we mentioned that year before, because the Zohar has a prophecy that in the year 5600, the redemption would begin. And Rav Yehuda Alkalai, he said that now is the time. According to the Zohar, this is the final deadline. The Zohar has many calculations for when it would be an auspicious time for the redemption to begin. This is the last one, 5600. And he actually said, Rabbi Yehuda, he said that if we don't do it now, God will do it for us. Like we have one final century to do it. This is an amazing prophecy. In 1840, he said we have 100 years to make Israel happen. And if we don't, then God will make it happen and it won't be in a good way. Right? And that's kind of what happened. Because 1840 and then you go to 1940 and following the Holocaust, that's kind of gave the final approval from the world. It took millions of Jews to be murdered for the world to say, okay, you know what, maybe we should give these people their own state.
And only temporarily.
Yeah. So, but Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai made that, he was a great Kabbalist, and he made that kind of almost like a prophecy. He said, based on the Zohar, we have 100 years to make it happen. And so he started this organization in 1840 to start settling Israel. And his ideas, people today think they're Herzl's ideas, but they're not. He said we have to make agricultural colonies, we have to get Jews farming again, make them self-sufficient, we have to get them to speak Hebrew, so that we can unite all the Jews from Europe, from here, from there, every Jewish... Rabbi Alkalai said that what's our common language? It's Hebrew. That's our language of our scriptures, that's our Torah language. We have to make it our spoken language too, because otherwise, he's Sephardi, he probably spoke Ladino, and then there's Yiddish, and then there's Bukharian, and then how do we all speak the same language? If we're all coming back to Israel, we got to return to Hebrew. So we have to do agricultural colonies. He said we're going to buy the land from the Ottomans. We're not going to conquer it. We're going to buy the land piece by piece. And he outlined all of this in his book, which was called Goral LeHashem. It was published in 1857, while Rabbi Alkalai was the chief rabbi of Semlin, Serbia. And in his congregation, who was one of his congregants and one of his friends, was Shimon Leib Herzl, who was Theodor Herzl's grandfather. And so today, scholars will admit and will agree that Herzl probably got a lot of his ideas from the book Goral LeHashem, which was a religious book by the chief rabbi of Semlin, Serbia. And a copy of it would have surely fallen into Theodor Herzl's hands. And so... right, that's a different story. But Herzl, he played an important role into turning it into a mass movement. That's really, it's not that he came up with the ideas. he was able to organize it. That the organization was key. He was able to get the support. He was able to meet with the right people, with the right world leaders, with the right philanthropists, and get the whole thing into a mass movement. Right? And he died young, so he didn't really see much fruit from what Herzl didn't. But really, Zionism, you can argue, it began among religious people, and the Hasidim played this big proto-Zionist role, and Herzl actually helped to spread it more to Western Europe, to England, to France, Germany, Austria. But it really only, like we saw, became a force in Eastern Europe. The Eastern Europeans who lived in the Pale of Settlement, who saw that they really have no hope, right? They tried, nothing was working to make their lives better. And so Zionism spread very rapidly in Eastern Europe, especially in the yeshivas. The yeshiva students were like, this is it. And many yeshiva students were becoming Zionists. That's where religious Zionism takes off in various ways. And many examples of yeshiva students who became staunch, fervent, passionate Zionists. One of them is Meir Bar-Ilan. We've all heard of Bar-Ilan University. Do you know what Bar-Ilan's original last name was? Bar-Ilan was originally Meir Berlin. Does that name sound familiar? Meir Bar-Ilan was the son of the Netziv. The Netziv was the Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, which was like the most famous yeshiva in Eastern Europe. The Netziv is Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, and his son is Meir Berlin, who became Meir Bar-Ilan in Israel, and this is kind of the spiritual founding figure of Bar-Ilan University, who was a rabbi.
Did he stay?
Yeah, he was religious. Meir Bar-Ilan was religious. He was always Orthodox.
Just Hebrew his name?
Yeah, in Israel, right? Like many of them did, right? And even the Netziv himself was he wasn't vocal about it, but he was a Zionist. Like, he believed that this is it. Like, this is the right way to go. And he was very interesting, amazing figure. You should all read up on the Netziv. Really amazing. See, he was the last Rosh Yeshiva, actually, of Volozhin, because the Russians shut it down. The Russians forced the yeshiva to teach secular studies and forced their curriculum upon them. And he said, you know what, it's better to close the yeshiva than to allow this. So he was the last. The Volozhin yeshiva closed with him. Another famous one more, is Wolf Vysotsky. You know Vysotsky, the tea? Everybody knows Vysotsky tea. Right? He was called the king of Russian tea in his day, very wealthy. Also a graduate of Volozhin. He was a graduate of Volozhin Yeshiva. He became huge in the tea trade, and then he couldn't stay in Russia because the anti-Semitism was too much, and so he moved to Israel. And he was a huge force in the Zionists. Like Israel, people know about Rothschild. Edmund Rothschild gave a lot of money for Israel. Moses Montefiore gave a lot. Wolf Wysotsky gave a lot. So he gave tons, millions, maybe billions. And he set up the first settlements in Gaza, Nablus, Lod, Yaffo, all of this. That was him. He paid for a lot of the first schools, hospitals. He gave something like, the amount of money that he gave in rubles is incredible. It's somebody estimated as in today's value, it would be billions of dollars. That's how wealthy he was. And he was a graduate of Volozhin, also religious his whole life. He never abandoned the faith. So you see all these Russian Jews that became a force to make Israel happen. And I already mentioned Tel Aviv was founded amidst the second Russian Aliyah and the Ganya Aleph. And look at all of Israel's leaders. Almost all of them are somehow connected to Russia. David Ben-Gurion was Polish-Russian. Golda Meir, Ukrainian-Russian. Moshe Dayan, also Ukrainian-Russian. Ariel Sharon and Menachem Begin, Belarusian. Fun fact, when Menachem Begin was born, the midwife that delivered him was Ariel Sharon's grandmother. So that's how close they were. So
Sharon wasn't Jewish halachically.
I've heard that. Maybe not.
How about
Netanyahus get their name from their grandfather, who was a rabbi also. And guess where he studied? Also Volozhin. So his name was Natan Milikovsky. Natan Milikovsky studied at Volozhin. He was a rabbi, and then became a religious Zionist rabbi. And so his pen name was Netanyahu, Natan Milikovsky, and then that's where the last name came from. So also, all these people come from the Russian Empire. And so when Israel formed initially, Stalin supported it. Right? Like he thought this is going to be like a communist country. They're going to join the Soviet umbrella.
A lot of influence over Israel for a long
That's
time.
right.
All the kibbutz movements and all that.
That's right. They thought the kibbutzim were like kind of communist little communes, and he thought that it's going to be, they're going to join the Soviet bloc, and that didn't happen. And so Stalin really turned on Israel, and the USSR turned on Israel. And have you heard of the Doctor's Plot? In 1953, Stalin actually tried to exterminate all the Jews in the Soviet Union. It was almost the second Holocaust. It's a really fascinating story. On January 9th, in the state newspaper, Pravda, they published an article that's saying that Jewish doctors are poisoning Soviet officials. There's a secret conspiracy among Zionists funded by the Americans to poison Russian officials, Soviet officials, even Stalin. They're attempting to assassinate Stalin. And so there was a huge wave of anti-Semitism in January, February 1953. And guess what? Stalin said we're going to make he commissioned 4 concentration camps in Kazakhstan and Siberia. And he said we're going to take all the Jews and bring them to these concentration camps for their own protection, because the Russian citizens are so passionately against the Jews for harming our people. And so Stalin planned on March 6th, 1953, to start deporting Jews to these gulags, these concentration camps, and to, finish. He had his own final solution for the Jews. And guess what happened? They were supposed to start deporting them on March 6th.
It was Purim. Maybe.
That's right. It was Purim, just a few days after Purim. The deportations were going to start March 6, 1953. Stalin died March 5th, 1953, the day before. So the 1st of March was Purim. On Purim, Stalin was found unconscious, or the day after. He was found unconscious and bleeding in his room. And he died on the 5th. There's a famous story of the Lubavitcher Rebbe who gave a sikha that night on Purim. And he was actually talking about the Soviet Union and the Russian Empire. And it was a very bizarre story. He was talking about when the Tsar of Russia was deposed, and the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe asked all his Hasidim to go vote. Like, you guys have to go vote. Now that we have democracy, we have to be good democratic citizens and do our part. And he basically gave a story about how Russians were, one of the Hasidim saw Russians screaming, hurrah, 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 right? Like, hooray. And this Chassid, who didn't know what they were saying, he probably only spoke Yiddish, thought that they were saying hurrah, that he's evil. So he thought that they were all saying that the Tsar was evil, the Caesar was evil, and he's finally gone, the king of Russia. And so the Rebbe started saying hurrah, 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 and the Hasidim were like weird in the Sikha. They thought something strange was going on, and they didn't realize that at the same time. So, like Chabad thinks that, like Chabadnikim will tell you that the Rebbe did something like on a spiritual level that affected events that were going on in Moscow, and maybe he did, because at the same time in Moscow, Stalin was having a mishteh, a party with his buddies, with his top officials, and it seems like they poisoned him. So his head of his secret police, Lavrenti Beria, probably maybe either slipped something in his drink or into his food, more likely. And so then, Stalin didn't recover from that. And they made sure that doctors wouldn't get into he collapsed in his room that night, and they made sure that no doctors would go in there for a very long time. And then Stalin died. And you should read a great book called Stalin's Last Crime by Jonathan Brent and Vladimir Naumov. Very interesting book that goes into this and shows everything that we know about this event. And in 1956, the next leader of Russia, Khrushchev, he gave a famous secret speech where for the first time they started to denounce Stalin, which would have before that been unthinkable. And in his secret speech, he actually suggested very clearly that they did him in. They personally assassinated him because he was planning to purge them. It seems like he had gone completely nuts. He was planning World War III. He was going to use the Doctor's Plot as a way to blame America for trying to assassinate him and launch a preemptive strike against America. So his own guys said, okay, that's enough. That's enough of Stalin. And they poisoned him. And Lavrenti Beria actually apparently boasted and said, I saved all you guys, I killed him. And So, and it happened on Purim, which is amazing because just like on Purim, we have Haman who was trying to exterminate all the Jews, and Stalin, in Haman fashion, was trying to kill all the Jews shortly after Purim, and himself died. Venafochu, everything was upside down. Just a last little note on that. In the book, in Stalin's Last Crime, the authors point something really cool. They say that their main problem for Stalin and his police with the doctor's plot was that there was a Jewish doctor, a woman, who refused to confess. They've tortured all the Jewish doctors to confess, but one of them wouldn't confess. And that's a problem, because if one claims innocence, then it ruins everything. Like, you need everybody to confess, or else, like, it doesn't work. And she refused to confess, even though she was, like, terribly, that she was, they were torturing these doctors, these innocent doctors, to confess that they were trying to assassinate Stalin and that they were poisoning Russian officials. And the others were, like, tortured so badly that they said, okay, whatever, right? They confessed under torture. But she did not confess, even under torture. Her name was Sofia Karpai. And their authors write really beautifully. They wrote, "It satisfies the imagination to think that the fate of the Jews of Russia might have depended on this latter-day unknown Esther," right? Which is really nice. That it was again a woman who held out and who was able to staunch their plans for a very long time, a Jewish woman, and helped to prevent this catastrophe. But anyway, the KGB Stalin's death didn't stop the Soviet attack on the Jews and on Israel in particular. And so I just want to point out, and we're going to end with this, Russia's role in the Arab-Israeli conflict, or the Soviet role in the Arab-Israeli conflict. And also this comes from a really good article that I can link to by Eli Cohen and Elizabeth Boyd, which points out a few things. That the founder of the PLO, of the Palestine Liberation Organization, is the KGB. Okay. This was hatched by the KGB. Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas, who's still the president, were KGB agents. Mahmoud Abbas, it's not a secret that he studied in Moscow. He did his PhD in Moscow. You know what his PhD was on? The current president of the PLO, this never-ending dictator, he's been the president. He was elected, 15 years ago for a 5-year term, and he's still the president. You know what his PhD is on? On denying the Holocaust. He wrote a PhD on that the Holocaust didn't happen. And by the way, other sources, very well sourced, that Mahmoud Abbas was originally a KGB agent in Damascus. He was a KGB secret agent operating in Damascus first, before he became dictator for life of the Palestinians. So all these people were KGB agents. The KGB and the Soviet Union armed the Palestinian, all their terrorists, including the Entebbe. The Entebbe attack was planned, and they were armed by the USSR. Even more scarier than that is something that was called by the KGB Operation SIG. And Operation SIG was basically to undermine Israeli, also American democracy, every way that they could, and to infiltrate every aspect of Israel, and also to change world opinion about Israel, to make Israel the enemy. The Zionists are the enemy. Remember, it was the Soviet Union that sponsored the UN resolution that supposedly claimed that Zionism is racism, right? Which was later repealed in 1991. It was Resolution 3379 in 1975, and it was revoked by the UN in 1991. But the resolution was that Zionism is equivalent to racism. The head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, he said, quote, "We have only to keep repeating our themes that the United States and Israel are fascists, imperial Zionist countries bankrolled by rich Jews. They just have to keep repeating it, and eventually people will believe it." It's like total brainwashing operation.
That was Joseph Goebbels.
Right, yeah, same idea, same playbook. And to this day, you see that conspiracy that was hatched by the KGB, that rich Jews and Zionists are plotting to take over the world. They run, right? The Elders of Zion. Who wrote the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? It originally published in Russia, right? And those same conspiracy theories, you still see them today, right? You send them to me all the time, right? The evil Jews are controlling the world. The Zionists are controlling the world. Right? It's really a product of Russian and later Soviet and KGB propaganda. It was really all a KGB plot to divide and conquer, right? Destabilize Western societies, transform them. Maybe you've seen this interview with Yuri Bezmenov. Have you seen this?
Bezmenov is the...
So he's a KGB agent that defected to Canada, actually. I think he lived in Windsor in 1970. And he gave an interview in 1984 where he outlines the KGB plans to destroy the United States. And if you listen to this interview that was given in 1984, today it's precisely what has happened to America. He said, our goal is to, basically he said, the KGB is not what you think. It's not an espionage organization. That's not the point. The KGB is it's a subversion organization. It's about infiltration, right? And it's a brainwashing organization. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to start with the academics. We're going to make them left-leaning, communist. We're going to start splitting the country on all kinds of lines, by gender, by race, black versus white, like all these things, class, we're going to split the country, we're going to divide and conquer, we're going to get everybody to hate each other, and we're going to destroy the country from the inside. And he goes step by step how we're going to do it. We're going to start with the academia, we're going to infiltrate the minds of the students, then they're going to move, and slowly you raise. Also, yeah, this operation that they plan to destabilize Western democracies, the U.S., Israel, all of these things. So,
but that's a plan of like 50 to 100 years.
Yeah, he said it would take 20 to 40 years or something like that.
It's 15 years you can demoralize a whole society.
Right. It doesn't take as long as you...
That's the same type of ingredients of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory also.
Yeah.
That's someone's so sophisticated, someone who's so sophisticated, they can get in and literally start mind controlling everybody.
Yeah. It's all part of the same thing, right? They can blame, the KGB can blame the Jews for what they're doing. That's precisely their plan, right? Like, we're doing this and we're going to blame it on the Zionists. So it's the USSR and the KGB that changed the world's perception from Israel is the underdog, is outnumbered 100 to 1 by Muslims and Arabs in particular, but Israel's the underdog, to, no, now the Palestinians are the underdog, right? And Israel is like the one single Jewish state, tiny little place. Israel is the oppressor, right? And the poor Palestinians that have nowhere to go, all the 50 other Muslim countries in the world, it's not enough, all the other Arab countries. Anyway, you get the point. So it's the Soviets hatched this plan to say, originally, like pre-state Israel, when people said Palestinian, it meant Jew. Like the Arabs were the Arabs, and the Palestinians were the Jews, right? If you look at flag of Palestine in the 1930s, it had the Magen David on it, right? When the country became Israel, they started referring to them as Israelis, and now the Arabs became the Palestinians, but that only happened much later, again, with the PLO and so on. Walid Shobat, he said this very famously. He's a Muslim, former terrorist, actually, for the PLO, and now he's like a pro-Israel, kind of, I guess, pro-Israel activist. He said, why is it that on June 4th, 1967, I was Jordanian, and overnight I became a Palestinian? Right? As long as Jordan controlled the West Bank and annexed it, nobody cared. Right? Jordan actually annexed the West Bank. Nobody cared. Yeah, it's Jordan. Same thing. But as soon as on June 5th, suddenly, no, Israel can't have. No, for sure. That's a red line, right? As long as he was Jordanian, that was fine. Suddenly, overnight, he became a Palestinian. And just just to see how deep the infiltration goes, in 1992, another KGB agent defected to the UK. His name is Vasily Mitrokhin, and he revealed all kinds of things, most of which are still classified by MI5, by the British, but some have been declassified. In those documents, at least 3 members of Knesset in Israel, at least 3, were KGB operatives. On Israel's Knesset.
Jewish or...
Who knows? They were all from the left-wing Mapam party, the Mapam, which is today Meretz. Not surprisingly, even their logo is like kind of very communist-y, like hammer and sickle style. So, but yeah, back then, like in the 50s, 60s, at least 3 members of Knesset that we know of were secretly KGB operatives. On Israel, that's how deep it goes. Like on Israel's parliament, supposedly representing the interests of Israelis and the Jewish people. And don't think for a second that it's not happening today. Right? Nothing's changed. Right? Just to conclude, I want to go back to the original question. Like, who is if there was a good candidate for Edom, for Magog, for this oppressive force that's been subversive and that's specifically for Jews, that's been oppressing Jews and subverting this in the state of Israel and infiltrating and attacking, and whether it's the pogroms, whether it's the Cantonist laws, the Pale of Settlement, take your pick. Right? Up through the present, through terrorism, through funding the Palestinians against Israel and changing the world's opinion to make Israel the bad guy always, whether it's at the UN or in the media or who is pushing all of this. And it's not the United States. Unfortunately, it's Russia and the USSR. Right? The Russian Empire began this trend, and it continued with the USSR. And it seems like it's still happening today. So we don't really know. It seems like Russia's relationship today, modern Russia's relationship with Israel, is better. They seem to be on good terms. They have a lot of trade. Where Russia stands today, we don't know. But in recent history, for sure, probably the single most, if there's one political entity that has been a thorn at the side of the Jewish people and Israel, it's probably Russia, the USSR, and so on. To bring it full circle on that notion of Russia and the Third Rome, and the Talmud's famous prophecy that there will be 3 Romes, and when the third Rome will fall, you should expect Mashiach to come, because there won't be a 4th Rome. So perhaps we are in that. Could this war lead to that? Russia seems to be doing quite all right, even with the war, even with the sanctions. So what this means for us, we don't know. It remains to be seen. But it's just interesting to point out Russian history, how Russian oppression really is what led to both Hasidism, to the establishment of the State of Israel. Would Israel exist today without Russian oppression? Probably not. And as we've seen, whether it's the second Aliyah, whether it's all these political leaders and prime ministers of Israel, all the big movers and shakers came from the former Russian Empire. The last point is just that Hasidism came out of Russian oppression, and I think it's Hasidism and Chabad Hasidism, but Hasidism that has put that in our minds, the notion of redemption, of Geula, that the redemption is near. And remember, the early Hasidim in particular were all about bringing about the redemption, and that's what we're awaiting. And hopefully that's what we will see soon, God willing. So we'll end with that.